Good afternoon, Glenn.
Hey, David. How you doing?
Well, I'm inferring from your Twitter feed that you're the one person in North America, Western Hemisphere, maybe the planet outside the Middle East, who's not overjoyed by the news of the successful killing of Osama bin Laden.
I would contest that premise in a couple ways. One is, I don't know that I'm not overjoyed. I don't think we know what happened, and until we know what happened in terms of the actual facts, I think it's difficult to assess what one's reaction ought to be. The other thing I'd point out is there's a huge amount of public opinion in other parts of the world outside of the Middle East, including in Europe. In Germany, for example, there's a poll saying 60% of the public opposes the killing, thinks that he should have been arrested. Angela Merkel had a huge controversy because she said she's thrilled that he died, and even members of her own party said that that's an inhumane and inappropriate a sentiment for our leader to express. So I'd be very careful about the mythology that what is mandated orthodoxy in the United States is mandated orthodoxy around the world.
Let me rewind, because you said you don't know how you feel. So but uncertainty is not the same as joy. So if you are uncertain, you are not overjoyed.
No, I think there's a distinction between how one feels about the fact that Osama bin Laden no longer exists on the earth, and how one feels about what the United States did to cause that to happen. I think that Osama bin Laden is responsible for the 9/11 attacks. I think the 9/11 attacks are one of the most heinous and wanton acts of slaughter of civilians in the past decade, an act of unmitigated evil, and that whoever is responsible for it, and I think Osama bin Laden is not somebody who I'm going to miss. But that's a much different question than what your view is of what the United States did to kill him.
Right. I understand that, but I just want to go through the immediate. That we are not just creatures of logic. We start our reasons are connected to our entire being. So I'm just curious to know, when you heard this news, you didn't have that thrill of joy, of relief, of feeling that something good had happened, that right had been vindicated, that innocence had justice brought to their killer?
No, it would be like if you said to me today, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was killed today. I think Khalid Sheikh Mohammed is the mastermind, the operational mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. But before I could tell you whether I was happy about that event, I would want to know, did he die because he got a hold of a gun and tried to kill Guantanamo guards and was shot in self-defense? Or did the United States order that he be executed while blindfolded and gagged and tied up and shot in the head and had his corpse dumped into the ocean? If it were the former, I would say, well, then that's probably a good thing. If it were the latter, I would say that's not a good thing. So how it happens is, to me at least, inextricably linked to what one's emotional reaction to the outcome is. I think the outcomes matter, but I think how you get to the outcome matters a lot as well.
You don't worry that maybe you're missing a little piece of connection to the country, to other people, that you can't, that has meant so much to others seems to leave you so cold?
Well, I think, again, you're suggesting that I have some kind of aberrational reaction and I'm standing alone. I don't think that's the case at all. I think I could point to, 1,000 things that have been written and said by people with platforms and by ordinary people around the world that is very similar to the things that I'm saying as well. So, I think it's a form of emotional blackmail to say this is an evil person, so I demand that you say that you're thrilled that he's gone no matter how it happened.
I'm not demanding anything.
It reminds me of the torture debates, well, how can you possibly object to what's being done to these people? These are horrible people. You shouldn't care what's happening to them. These are evil terrorists. But I cared what was happening to them because I cared what the United States does and the standards to which we adhere, and I care in this case as well.
Well, I'm certainly not trying to blackmail you, and you have obviously a strong internal core. You're not going to be blackmailed, but I'm trying to get something. Because I was reading your Twitter feed today, and I couldn't quite get a handle on how you were feeling about all this. And I think it's interesting and maybe a good jumping off off point. And what you just said then maybe opens another door that I'm curious about. You know the old jibe of Macaulay's that the Puritans were annoyed at bear baiting not because it gave pain to the bear, but because it gave pleasure to the spectators.
Right.
Now, I wonder here that it's what I can understand the mind of the liberal legalist who says legal process to me is the most important thing in the world, and I care about that intensely. But it's not because I'm so worried about the bear. But I want to just clarify here that Osama bin Laden deserved to die. You agree? You don't disagree with that, and that on that threshold point we can begin. That this was one of history's monsters, a killer of your fellow citizens. He deserved to die.
There's questions about whether the death penalty is an appropriate sentence, things of that nature. But I don't have any qualms about the fact that Osama bin Laden is dead, if that's what you're asking.
So where did the
I don't harbor any sympathy for Osama bin Laden. I don't regret the fact that he no longer is alive. So
where's the qualm?
That's what you're asking, though. That's my answer.
Where's the qualm?
Well, the qualm is, I'll tell you what the qualm is. If you look, for example, at what the Nuremberg trials were about and what the leading American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, Robert Jackson, said, obviously the Allied powers who had captured and apprehended the Nazi war criminals who committed the most heinous crimes, not of the last decade, but of the last, multiple centuries in human history. Obviously, the Allies could have just taken them out back and shot them in the head, and nobody would have cared. Robert Jackson talked about the reason they didn't do that, and that it was so important that they didn't do that, is because the conduct that the Allies were engaged in were going to determine their national character, who they were, what principles they were defending, and so that it was vital not to just shoot the Nazis in the head, but to put them on trial in accordance with Western precepts of justice, show the world the evidence against them, give them the opportunity to defend themselves, and then through a rational standard process of justice, convict them and impose punishment. The Israelis said the same things about Adolf Eichmann. So I think those things are crucial. That's not just a matter of being overly legalistic or liberal or whatever. That's the core of Western justice as we've defined it since at least the end of World War II.
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily liberal, but it is certainly legalistic, and it's not something that it's something that you do or you can do when you have a completely crushed and defeated enemy. And where the enemy society is smashed to pieces, as German society was, and where one might almost say a little cynically that one of the purposes of Nuremberg, I have always thought, was to concentrate the guilt of Germany on a very finite number of people. That is, by trying the Nuremberg defendants, you implicitly gave a kind of pass to everybody who was not on trial, and that was tens of millions of people who had a lot more implication in those crimes than anybody in 1945 on our side wanted to acknowledge. But in the case of bin Laden and bin Ladenism, his cause, it looks pretty sick. I think it's certainly on the way out, but it's not destroyed and defeated. And that need to give an excuse to large numbers of people isn't there.
Yeah, look, I think that, that's a pretty cynical view to take of Nuremberg. For a long time, Nuremberg sort of been viewed as the peak of Western justice. We refer to the Nuremberg principles all the time. What we said at the time was that this was going to set standards that would bind not just losing parties in war, but especially victors, that it was particularly important that we applied it to ourselves in victory at the time and in future generations, and how just World War II ended up being, said the Nuremberg prosecutors, would be determined by how much we adhered to its standards. And, I think the idea that Osama bin Laden is some sort of active terrorist mastermind at this point, is dubious in the extreme. I don't think he's been very significant over the past, 5 or 6 years. He's barely ever talked about terrorist plots that we've broken up, not been linked to him at all. They've been, linked to Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula and other places. So I do think he's tantamount to the Nazi war criminals who were apprehended, much closer to the Nazi crimes than, the 9/11 attacks, which are now 10 years ago. And I do think it was preferable, if it was possible, and we don't know if it is, to have put him on trial and punished him after due process. But let me ask you this: we don't know what happened. So we've heard everything from, he died in a firefight while resisting, to no, he was unarmed, but he was using his life as a human shield. Well, no, that's not true. Most of the people in the house barely got off of a shot, and there's even a report from his 12-year-old daughter through Pakistani officials, which we don't know is true at all, but it could be, that he was actually killed after he was captured. And there's some support for that in what President Obama said in the formulation he used, which is he announced the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden. If that were the case, if we actually captured him, if we had him in custody, if he were a helpless detainee, and then we simply put 2 bullets into his head and dumped his body into the ocean, would that change the calculus for you at all?
First, on that last story, I am going to take with a lot of salt anything that's said by the Pakistani government or anybody connected to it, because their PR problem here is obvious, and their PR imperatives, I think, are pretty clear. So let me set that story to one side.
But I hope, just quickly, I hope you're also taking with a grain of salt what the American government is saying, both because of its history in general and in this particular case of not having the story straight. That's right. We don't know what happened.
It seems firefights are pretty confused things, and there have been some confusion. And I think in the course of time we will have a very clear narrative of what happened, and there must be a lot of video footage that was from the cameras on the top of the soldiers' heads that I assume they were carrying. Hillary Clinton was watching something in that shot that had her hand to her mouth. But I think it was right to kill him. I think that got closure. I would have regarded a capture as being a pretty poor outcome. I think the president was exactly right about that. Capture would mean months and months and years of jail and legal process, and where should he be tried and how, and reviving the whole debate about trial in Lower Manhattan. This is a military enemy of the United States. Congress passed a resolution declaring war on him. You capture him in the sphere of battle, and whatever happened in the 1.5 or 3 3/4 seconds before he died, I'm not going to worry about it too much. I think this was handled exactly correctly by all accounts.
And that doesn't change and I know I'm asking hypothetically because, again, we don't know what happened. I'm just trying to test your view. A lot of people have the view, look, I don't care at all how Osama bin Laden died. I'm just happy that he's dead, and however he died, I'm thrilled. So I'm just trying to get a view in that camp. If, for example, and again, we don't know, but I'm just asking hypothetically, and there is a report suggesting it, that I agree should be taken with a grain of salt, but if we had captured him, he's in handcuffs, he's sitting down on the ground with his hands behind his back and his legs bound, totally helpless, and everything is secure, and then we put bullets into his head, would you be totally fine with that as well? That wouldn't change the calculus for you?
That might trouble me a little bit, but I would find that such a far-fetched hypothetical, because we are dealing with warriors with codes. The best of America's best, and that it is incredible to me. It is so beyond incredible to me that is what happened. And the fact that the Pakistani government tells me that that's what happened, those are the same guys who told me they had no idea where bin Laden was. I put very little stock, if any, in what they have to say.
Right, but then at the very least, once you say that, then your assessment of the rightness and propriety of what happened is dependent upon knowing the facts, right? I mean,
let me put it this way. My assessment of the perfect satisfaction of what happened may vary. Obviously, the preferred outcome is to have the American soldier lock eyes with. I would also be disappointed if you told me that there wasn't a moment's pause in which the American soldier locked eyes with bin Laden, and bin Laden knew that his death was there. I would have been. If the United States had bombed the compound from the air and killed him in his sleep, that would be the end of bin Laden. I would find that disappointing too. So there are a lot of ways to make it more perfect. But we're not writing screenplays here. That we are just dealing with the fact that in this what looks like a flawlessly executed operation, America's most desperate and heinous contemporary enemy has been dispatched without an arduous legal process, knowing that he had been caught. That to me is very important, and I don't see anything here to celebrate. And the Nuremberg model.
Let me ask you this.
I want to say one more thing about Nuremberg.
Go ahead.
Because I think if that is like the foundational text in your worldview, I think your worldview may need more history and less law in it. Because, in fact, to do justice in Germany we would have had to have killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. Nuremberg, and we said I'm too cynical. I'm totally cynical about Nuremberg. It was a whole series of fictions, starting with the fact that there was a Soviet judge, or a bunch of Soviet judges on the panels. But there were murderers who collected pensions from the German state until the day of their death. We did not visit anything like justice on Germany because justice in Germany would have been impossible. It would have laid waste to a country that's a very important country.
So you think that what the Israelis did, for example, when they apprehended and abducted, basically kidnapped Adolf Eichmann, that they should have just killed him and bring him back to Jerusalem?
No, I
trial was the wrong thing to do.
I didn't say that either. Because
I'm asking. No, I know you didn't. I'm asking you.
The Eichmann trial, taken years after the fact, was a demonstration. It was an act of moral theater. I think it had a lot to recommend it in that sense. And partly because he was so defeated, and partly because there had been time, and partly because so many people at that time were putting the Nazi crimes under the carpet. I mean, they were not as big an issue, incredibly, in the early 1960s.
How much time has elapsed between 9/11 and what bin Laden did? Almost a full decade.
It wasn't the lapse of time, as I was just trying to say. It was the fact that in 1962, the consciousness of this crime was too low. And the reason for the trial was precisely to have an elaborate demonstration and reminder of what had happened at a time when it got relatively little attention. Because in 1962, the former criminals who worked for the German state, East and West, were not receiving pensions. They were actually still in government. And they were school teachers, and they were judges, and they were heads of corporations. That the world had given Germany after the war, I mean, the war was horrible, but after the war had given Germany a very light touch of responsibility. So the Eichmann trial was a show in that way. It was a moral theater. But
so let me ask you. The current right now we are, and by the way, I think one of the benefits of giving people trials before killing them is a demonstration about our values and who we are as a people, and how that we are distinguished from the people who we say that we're fighting against because they're so fundamentally different than we are. I think that's one of the benefits of it. But right now in Guantanamo, we are holding somebody who bears at least as much responsibility for the 9/11 attacks as Osama bin Laden, and that's Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's alleged to be not just the spiritual head of Al-Qaeda, but the operational mastermind of the attack, someone who actually put it into motion. There's at least as little doubt about his guilt as there was about Osama bin Laden's. Do you think that we ought to just take him out basically today and shoot him in the head, or are you we have him a military commission in the trial?
But I think we did the right thing with him too. At that time, we knew he was captured early. He had information that we needed. You wanted to take him alive so you could question him. And at this point, he's in American custody, so you can't just shoot him out of hand. He needs some kind of legal process. I don't know why that hasn't happened. Let's do it. I'm actually not over fussy about whether this distinction between military commissions and civilian trials. I don't get too excited about. I think I have a mild preference for military commission and a mild preference for not doing it on American soil. But if it were to happen that they were to start tomorrow as a civilian trial and in a New York courtroom, that wouldn't bother me too much either. Just let's do it.
What would be the objection? What would be the principled objection to just taking him out and shooting him in the head tomorrow or today?
It's not just a principled objection; it's a political objection, and I think one of the things that. Is there a principled objection? I think if a man has been in custody in American custody for a long time, you don't shoot him out of hand. But I also think you want to do.
What does that mean? Like if he's in custody for a week, it's okay to just shoot him in the head, but after a year, it becomes kind of unpleasant, and you should probably give him some process. I mean, to me, my view is that once someone's in your custody. Mm-hmm. And as a helpless detainee in your custody, that you don't shoot them in the head and dump their body into the ocean without giving them some process.
But
that they've actually, because by then they're incapable of harming you any further. That's the nature of being a captive.
But then the question is, you think that's a clear line. But the question of when does custody start, and when we're measuring in tenths of a second, which is what I think when we get down to the bin Laden case, if the video is ever released, there will be people who say, "Gee, he looks at that." At that moment 92 out of 100, he looks completely helpless. So there's no reason to have killed him at moment 98 out of 100. But these things happen to the people who are there, who are at risk very fast. So I don't think it's going to be too punctilious. But I think that with a lot of these things, as I said to you before, just as I think you're thinking about this needs more history with your law, it also needs more politics with your law. That one of the things that we achieve by killing bin Laden, and whether he started to say the words "I surrender" or whether he, got, how many, whether he tried to vocalize it, how much of that vocalization he got out. I very much doubt he got out the whole phrase. It didn't give him that long. That this now allows us to close it. I mean, one of the things I would be thinking, if I had your politics, never mind your legal view, and wanted, for example, the United States out of Afghanistan, the United States is out of Afghanistan a lot faster with a dead bin Laden than it is with a bin Laden who's in some brig somewhere.
Okay, let me just make a couple points what you said. First of all, this idea about, this is the same discussion about law and mixing law and balancing with politics and the like that we had the last time about whether Bush officials should be prosecuted and the like for what I think is their clear law breaking. I look at John Adams, and what he said was you have two choices. You can be a nation of laws or you can be a nation of men. And once you start saying that leaders are free to just liberate themselves from the law in pursuit of political or prudential ends, then you're essentially freeing leaders from the constraints of law. Law no longer is what Thomas Paine said it should be, which is the only monarch, the king. It becomes just one of many factors to weigh, and leaders' unconstrained decisions become permissible. And I don't trust that. I trust the bounds of law, as the founders did, much more than anything else. But I think even from the political perspective, one of the things that everybody across the spectrum has agreed upon, more or less, you can find some dissenters, but more or less, is that we're not going to win the war on terror by exterminating all the terrorists, because the more we try to do that, the more we create. It's about perceptions in the Muslim world. And I actually think that taking Osama bin Laden and showing the Muslim world how we handle and treat everybody in our detention, Muslims or non-Muslims alike, the most hated to the most beloved, that we treat them equally under the law by giving them due process, showing the world the evidence that he was actually guilty, given that a lot of people still don't believe it, and only executing him then, if we did at Nuremberg, the way that we did with lots of war criminals, would be way more politically beneficial to our ends in the Muslim world than what it is that we did. And the final point I would say about Afghanistan, I'm completely unconvinced that the killing of bin Laden is going to help us get out of Afghanistan. I think that what happens is whenever there are events like this that rejuvenate this American excitement about the military and the use of force, I think it makes wars more likely. I think it lets the commander-in-chief have much greater freedom in terms of what he does, because now there's greater trust of the citizenry in him. And I think that that this is the sort of thing that's going to keep us in the Middle East for a lot longer. It shows the glory of war and of killing. And it's a huge number of people in the citizenry who are accepting the idea after being skeptical for a decade, that we really do have lots to benefit from things like sending Navy SEALs into sovereign countries that we're not at war with and using force with no due process. So I actually am not at all convinced that it's going to help end wars. I think quite the opposite. It's probably going to militarize the might of the country even further. Well,
I hear 4 points there. Let me... two of them I can dispatch very quickly. Let me respond. First, John Adams.
Good. There won't be two left. Okay.
Now I can say what I have to say. I don't mean that they will be dispatched. Okay. Osama bin Laden, 2 bullets in the head. John Adams, not my favorite founding father by any means. I'm with Ben Franklin on that one, who said that Adams was always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes on many things just out of his senses. I'm with the American tradition that says foreign.
But wait, David, before you move on, there are things that I don't like about John Adams as well, but the idea that you can be a nation of laws or a nation of men, that's sort of elemental to our entire. That wasn't one of his controversial propositions.
I'm with those with that long American tradition that says that the realm of law is the realm where there's a sovereign, that law governs the relations within a state. In a world of states, it is a very ambitious project to govern the relations between states by law. And I think if you and I, that would be, if we were to say, what is the one thing that we could spend the next 100 hours, 1,000 years arguing about, it is that the relations between states are not governed by law. We can try to legalize them, and to some extent, that is a form of human progress. The fact that international postal conventions and things like that. But in the end, where there are
things like the Geneva Conventions, that's law, right? When we enter into a treaty, that the Senate ratifies and the President signs, the Constitution says it becomes the supreme law of the land. That's law, isn't it? That governs our conduct with other nations and with other people.
To some extent, that is right, and but it's a process. That the idea that we have an international rule of law, or that we ever can, or that we ever will, or that we ever should, until the day when we have one world government with all people voting in it, and it's an elected government, I find it that it's ultimately it's a receding mirage. That the relations between states are governed by power, and the relations outside between Americans and those outside the American boundary, those things are ultimately governed by power. That you can have a lot of law mixed with
might makes right, basically.
No, you have a lot of law mixed with your power, but you cannot take your way. It is not that the rule of law in the way that Adams described as applying inside the boundaries of the United States. It is simply it's a fiction, sometimes romantic, more often dangerous to imagine that happening between the United States and the rest of the world, or between any two countries.
Israel and its neighbors.
You can sometimes have cases like the EU, where you can see countries on the way to transforming international law to domestic law, and how that will work out is a fascinating question. I think about it a lot, and sometimes I'm optimistic and sometimes not. But yeah, Israel's neighbors are, I think, with two exceptions, are all in a state of war with Israel. So of course those relations are governed by power. So that I think is just it's a dream, in some ways romantic, in many ways dangerous. I think so the idea that this is something that is a casualty of this, and this goes to your point about sending the Navy SEALs in. Pakistan had made a series of undertakings in the United States. Pakistan has entered into covenants and agreements and relationships, accepted money, and Pakistan has been on notice for a long time, and very emphatically by this president, that if it shelters this man, bin Laden, it is at risk of having its territory penetrated. And they knew what they were doing. And to the extent that important people in Pakistan are implicated here, and they then complain about the violation of their sovereignty, I'm sorry, what they did with bin Laden, if it is really true that this is an act of war, and if they are let up lightly from that, they are winners here. The fact that it's merely...
So if it's proven that high government officials and military officials in Pakistan knew of bin Laden's whereabouts and shielded him from the U.S., what do you suggest happens? What are you hoping happens?
I think we did the right thing. But I'm saying, let me put it this way. If the president had, instead of sending the SEALs, had gone to Congress with the photographs and said the government of Pakistan is sheltering Osama bin Laden, I ask for a declaration of war against Pakistan, he'd have got it. That is absolutely an act.
No, I don't have much of a problem with sending the SEALs into Pakistan in order to get it. Because I think that the protestations of the Pakistani officials about this are for public consumption. I think privately they acquiesce to what the United States wants to do in its territory. I don't think those objections are genuine. But what I'm asking you is,
we don't know. There's a lot of Pakistan's a very mysterious place, and if they were so delighted that we got them, they could have been just as delighted 6 years ago.
There's different factions and the like, and it's not yet at all proven that Pakistan did know that where bin Laden was. But if it turns out that military officials and government officials in Pakistan did in fact know where bin Laden was and actively harbored him, shielded him from detection from America, what do you think is the proper response to that? I mean, a war in Pakistan, or
no? I think what is going to happen. I hope we're on the right track. I mean, I think as I said, I'm not on domestic policy. I have a lot of disputes with this president. I think he handled this exactly correctly, and now I think Pakistan comes under intense pressure. And I think our relationship with Pakistan gets downgraded.
But what does that mean, Dave? What does that mean, Dave? Exactly. Like, what repercussions should befall them?
Well, here's what it means. And this is where I think your question about how this doesn't mean anything for Afghanistan. The reason it means a lot for Afghanistan is if we are in Afghanistan to get bin Laden, we put up with the hijinks of the Pakistanis in order to support our campaign in Afghanistan. It turns out that one of the hijinks of the Pakistanis is shielding the very person for whose sake we are in Afghanistan. And you think, this whole thing looks upside down to me. That the idea we're paying you to help us support a military mission whose purpose is the thing you're doing, that's crazy. And if what it means is that in order to have a tougher relationship with Pakistan, we need to be less committed to Afghanistan, then I'm not that concerned about the future governance of Afghanistan.
You think that we've been fighting in Afghanistan for the last decade and sustaining all of the losses and spending all of that money in order to get Osama bin Laden?
I sure don't think we've been doing it in order to get our hands on their impressive natural resources of rocks and more rocks.
Well, no, I mean, but even George Bush, when asked multiple times about whether that was the goal, said that wasn't an important priority at all. I mean, I don't think anybody has said that Osama bin Laden has been, if you look at the discourse of terrorism and foreign policy over the last 5 years, Osama bin Laden has basically been disappeared. I mean, his significance at this point is purely symbolic. I mean, nobody thinks that he's the mastermind of some vast al-Qaeda network and running it and planning terrorist plots. I mean, and if you look at what John Brennan and Obama's top national security advisors have been saying, they've been saying for a long time that the true al-Qaeda threat lies in lawless territories like Somalia and especially in the Arabian Peninsula. So the idea that we're involved in this decade-long horrendous war in order to get Osama bin Laden is something that nobody, I think, has maintained, and that's why I don't think his disappearance is going to help get us out of there.
I'm about to maintain this. First, the war was a lot smaller until 2 years ago. One of the points of the Bush foreign policy was not to go so long on Afghan futures, and the American footprint in Afghanistan was kept deliberately very small through all the Bush administration, a decision that I think was much criticized in 2004 and 2008, but looks very good right now. Second, President Obama made a big commitment to Afghanistan. In order to stabilize a situation that was deteriorating. But the idea that we are going to now have large numbers of Americans fighting indefinitely for a better future for the people of Afghanistan, I don't wish them ill, but that strikes me as a lot to ask for a country that is not one of the more strategically important places on this earth. First of all, one of the mysteries of Afghanistan has been why we are fighting there, and I don't think we've been able to get clear answers even from its most ardent opponents. But to the extent that I've been able to discern rationale for why we are fighting there and why we have to continue fighting there, it's because we fear a return of Al Qaeda, but mostly because we fear the destabilization of Pakistan from religious extremists, from the Pakistani Taliban forces. So that's why I think
how does Osama bin Laden's liquidation address that problem? I mean,
because it means what Osama bin Laden's liquidation means is the discovery of him there tells us the religious extremists are already in important control in Pakistan, and Pakistan is the problem.
So
and the Karoom shot.
Our need to be there, our strategic imperative to be there. I mean, so
I think it reduces the strategic imperative.
We already lost. The fundamentalists took over, so we can pack up and go home now.
No, on the contrary, what it means is it's time to rethink this three-bank shot, where we deal with the Pakistan problem with a huge commitment to Afghanistan. The Pakistan problem has to be dealt with on the merits of the Pakistan problem. That Afghanistan, I think a large part of why we have the huge commitment we currently do has to do with the internal politics of the Democratic Party in the 2006-2008 period, where Barack Obama needed to find a war to be in favor of, and so he was in favor of Afghanistan, so he didn't look too left-wing when he criticized Iraq. But I'll give him a pass on all of that, and that the United States has now achieved some stability in the urban sectors of Afghanistan. At this point, this is a good moment to begin to think, is there a way to create some new kind of government that can be more inclusive and for us to worry a lot less about what is going on in Afghanistan so that we have space to be less held to ransom by the people creating the current problem in Afghanistan, which is the government of Pakistan, which is a real problem, not I would say our only real problem, but a real problem. And which was to a great extent replaced Saudi Arabia.
I guess time will tell whether... to me, I think having arrested bin Laden and put him in an American facility and tried him and then executed him upon a guilty finding would have achieved the same thing. But I don't think that removing him from the equation has anything to do with it. The only extent to which I find it persuasive
that spectacular public discovery of him inside Pakistan.
It takes away the political pretext. I don't think that bin Laden has much at all to do with why we've been in Afghanistan. I think to the extent that it helps Obama to get out of Afghanistan, if that's what he wants to do, it just helps to be able to say, now that we killed Osama bin Laden, our need to be there is no longer as compelling.
Well, let me put it this way. I think the non-capture of bin Laden is an important reason why we're in Afghanistan. If we had successfully killed bin Laden in December, of 2001, which some people think is possible. I don't know. But supposing we had done that, no way would there be 100,000 American troops in Afghanistan right now. No way. We would have wound that up fast.
Right. Because back then, Osama bin Laden was important. I mean, he really was the justification for being in Afghanistan. 10 years later, he simply isn't.
But 10 years later, this is a commitment that is sustained by inertia, that we are in Afghanistan so that we don't lose in Afghanistan, because having not killed bin Laden, we have to worry about losing in Afghanistan. Now we don't have to worry about that so much, because now now we're confronted with Afghanistan qua Afghanistan, and the question: how important is it? How much is it worth this huge American presence? How dangerous is our downside risk in Afghanistan? And what everybody says, the downside risk is that bad things will happen in Pakistan. So let's focus on the bad things that can happen in Pakistan.
So you believe that by the 2012 election there will be not a modest or symbolic withdrawal, but a substantial withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, as that would not have happened in the absence of the killing of Osama bin Laden?
I was hoping for a simpler question. Do I think the president...
Right, let me break that up then. Let me just ask you, do you think by 2012 there will be a substantial withdrawal of combat troops from Afghanistan by the 2012 election?
Let me think. The president has said so.
Well, he said that that there's been ambiguity in that, right? He said they're going to start withdrawing combat troops, and the Petraeus came out and said, but it's only going to be determined by the reality on the ground.
I'm not going to be able to answer this question with as high a degree of confidence as I'd like. And if I can frame my own question, I can answer that more confidently. But to answer yours, I think probably. I think we're going to see not all the American troops out any more than we'll see all the American troops out in Iraq. I think we're going to see probably a continuing presence of a lot of UN aid and a lot of protection for aid workers in major urban centers, especially Kabul. But do I think we're going to have the troop presence that we do now? No. I think the president is probably going to make good on a large part of that commitment. I think my guess is it goes fairly quickly. And I think it will take on, and I think it will depend a little bit on how things happen in Pakistan. What steps does Pakistan take to mollify the United States, if any? Those could shape the politics of the region. But I'm inclined to think, withdrawal more rather than withdrawal less.
So, and just one last question about this, and then I just want to make one more point about the bin Laden killing. You said earlier that, and it was notable for me, that you have a lot of differences with the president on domestic policy, and I know you do. But notably missing, conspicuously missing, for me at least, in that formulation were the existence of significant differences in the foreign policy context. As one of the most sort of identifiable neoconservatives of the last decade, the Bush speechwriter attributed with several neoconservative mottos that kind of define the Bush foreign policy. Is your assessment of Obama's foreign policy and counterterrorism policies basically positive?
Well, I will have specific criticisms there as well. And I didn't say that to imply that, but on foreign policy, it's hunky-dory. I was saying that on this thing that he has done, I think he's done it right. Now, I have disagreements with him. I have disagreements with him on what he's done in the Western Hemisphere. I was very unhappy about Honduras. But I have been impressed by the extent to which his counterterrorism policy is continuous with his predecessor. By the way, his predecessors.
You mean that the Bush-Cheney architecture for dealing with terrorism has, in essence, continued under Obama, and you're happy about that?
But let me point out something else. I think the Bush policy was much more.
Is that true? That's true. What I said, though.
Yeah, that is true. I think it's all. I would say something else. That is, I think the Bush policy was much more continuous with the Clinton policy than people generally recognize. I think our counterterrorism policy has not. There have been some spectacular deviations and some spectacular arguments, but the main lines of it are pretty consistent. After all, it's carried out by the same people. I mean, the John Brennans and the David Petraeuses, they work
for it's the national security state. Although
they work for these three different presidents, and by the way, and they've made some mistakes, but they've done some good work too. What is that?
Right, exactly. It's a bipartisan national security state that pretty much maintains the same consensus. Although one big difference,
there are differences.
And maybe this political controversy was overstated, although one big difference was that the Clinton administration tended to treat terrorism from a law enforcement perspective. They put the first World Trade Center bombers, including the Blind Sheik, on trial in civilian court in Manhattan. There weren't really invasions of countries. We lobbed some missiles at, some cruise missiles at the Sudan and Afghanistan, but by and large, it was treated as a law enforcement problem. The Bush, and this gets back to the Bin Laden point I wanted to make that I find so fascinating. The Bush administration, one of the principal fundamental changes was to shift from a law enforcement paradigm to a war paradigm, that it was no longer a law enforcement problem, it was now a war on terror. And when John Kerry ran for president in 2004, the way in which he distinguished the Democratic position on terrorism from the Republican position on terrorism was to say that we should not look at things from a war perspective. We shouldn't treat terrorists as warriors. We should treat them as criminals and use law enforcement tools. And that was pretty much the official Democratic position for the last decade. And you even had people like Matt Yglesias, who wrote a long article in 2008 saying John Kerry was right. George Will wrote an article in the Washington Post in 2008 saying John Kerry was right. This should be treated as law enforcement. The terrorists are criminals, not warriors. And now what you see from not just Republicans, which one would expect it from, but from Democrats justifying the killing of bin Laden is a return to the war paradigm, that Osama bin Laden is a warrior who was at war with the United States. He was a legitimate military target. I mean, in a law enforcement context, you could never, ever, ever shoot an unarmed suspect who's not resisting. In a military or a war paradigm, you can. And so to justify it, you're seeing lots and lots of Democrats embrace the war paradigm that had been the Bush-Cheney fundamental change from how Clinton approached terrorism. It's on a continuum more than I may have suggested, but that was a significant change. There is a dichotomy there.
I'm going to agree with a lot of that, but I want to note something. The change from a law enforcement to a war paradigm did not happen on Inauguration Day of 2001. That was not a Democratic versus Republican thing. It happened on 9/11.
Correct.
In July, George Bush criticized the Clinton administration for not being respectful enough of the civil liberties of terrorist suspects. He was against secret evidence in immigration hearings.
And from having a too interventionist and muscular and an insufficiently humble foreign policy. You're absolutely right.
So the question is,
it did happen.
It was a reaction to
change.
It was a reaction to this event. Now, my question is, if Al Gore had won the recount, had prevailed in the recount, and he had been president on 9/11, would Al Gore have used a law enforcement mentality? I very much doubt it. I think
that's hard to say. That's hard to say, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. But what I do know is that when John Kerry ran in 2004, and this was the first time the Democrats had the opportunity to draw a contrast between themselves and the Republicans on terrorism, other than the Iraq War, which of course Kerry supported and wasn't really fertile ground therefore for drawing a contrast. The big contrast was when Kerry stood up and said, I think that the big mistake of the Bush administration is treating terrorists as warriors and treating terrorism as a war problem instead of as a law enforcement problem and treating them as criminals. And that wasn't just some aberrational view that Kerry enunciated. He was the standard bearer of the Democratic Party, and that became the conventional wisdom of Democrats in general about how to approach terrorism and the big difference between Democrats and Republicans. We don't believe in this, looking at this as a war. We don't want to glorify Al-Qaeda fighters as warriors and treat them as war fighters or as combatants.
And then they won.
They should be treated as criminals with due process and in a court of law. And
then they won.
With which that was abandoned, with which that's being abandoned to justify this killing of bin Laden, which is only justifiable in a war context, not a law enforcement context, has been just very striking to me.
And then they won and decided that the people who they used to think were sullying the fine name of the United States may have had more point behind them after all. And so I think this is, what you see as a tragedy, which is the Democrats falling away from their positions of 2004, may be maturation. And maybe the outlier here was that the things that John Kerry was saying in 2004 were irresponsible and unconsidered and driven by the needs of his anguished base. And that now the Democrats have elected a president, they elected a Congress, they looked at the situation, they've had to make the decisions, and they think that, there's some things about the Bush-Cheney policy that they didn't like, or there's some things about the Bush-Cheney policy as it existed in 2002 and 2003 that they didn't like, but that looking at from 2011 back at what was being done in 2007 and 2008, they think they basically, laid down some positive tracks.
Look,
I tend to think one more sentence.
And this is honestly.
I tend to think of this as American government working. This is the feature, not the bug. It is.
I don't know. I tend to think that when a president stands up and says that this foreign policy and this counterterrorism policy, not a president but a presidential candidate, repeatedly says that it is a fundamental betrayal of our values, that it requires fundamental change, that I intend to reverse it all and restore who America is and what our values are, and restore the rule of law and eliminate these policies and close Guantanamo and no longer hold people without due process and no longer treat this as some kind of a global battlefield, but instead to do it in conformity with our values and our legal principles and traditions, that becomes a covenant between him and the American people, and that when he violates it, that is a bad thing. But the thing that I will agree with you on, and that I've said before, and I don't mean this, rhetorically or to make a point or whatever, is that there are a huge number of policies that Bush and Cheney adopted that Democrats used to inveigh against as the root of all evil and as shredding of the Constitution, like detaining people indefinitely without charges, like invoking the state secrets privilege to shield executive conduct from judicial review, like denying detainees habeas corpus the way we're doing in Bagram, like the idea that the president has the authority to assassinate people around the world without any oversight, that are all policies that the Obama administration and Democrats have now embraced for reason, and I think Republicans are right, like you, to stand up and say, we were slandered all these years by Democrats who have now adopted these very policies. And I do think the Democrats who support those things and who say, well, maybe Obama now saw some things that he didn't know before now that he's president and he gets intelligence briefings, or now he has responsibility for national security because he's no longer just a candidate and can't rail against these things irresponsibly. I think the Democrats owe George Bush and Dick Cheney an apology for the things that they said about those policies that they have now embraced. I mean,
I think there's a lot. I concur. I concur. But it's also true. But wait a minute. It's also true that in 1998 and 1999, Democrats were for those things. That Bill Clinton signed authorization to assassinate bin Laden, and Bill Clinton engaged in extraordinary rendition. In fact, he invented it. His administration did. So maybe what happened here is the Democrats went on a kind of...
That's not quite true.
The Democrats went on a detour.
The rendition programs, but it is true that there is some continuum. But you yourself said that there were some pretty significant changes in the wake of 9/11 that distinguish it from what Bill Clinton was doing.
But let me put it this way: Bill Clinton in 1998 was more. If there's a continuum from Cheney in 2003 to Kerry in 2004, Bill Clinton was not with Kerry in 2004. He was on a continuum. Bill Clinton of vintage 1998. And this is how, by the way, this is how the American government gets things right. I mean, that you say, well, maybe we overshot maybe we're too panicked in 2002 and 2003 and did some things we shouldn't. Okay, well, course correct. But it's also true that this candidate who said, Barack Obama, who said all these things in 2006 and 2007, lodged all these accusations, he overshot. And now he's more in the main course. And we could have a little bit more of a steady consensus between the parties on how we defend the national security of the United States.
But that begs the question. I mean, the mere fact that a president runs for office based on certain policies that he then abandons when he's president has many potential causes. Maybe he's too politically scared to follow through on those policies. Maybe there are powerful factions standing in his way that he's not willing to challenge and take on. Maybe he has other priorities.
Stop. Say your first thing. What's he scared of?
It could be the case that he realizes those policies are wrong. It could be the case that he was right as a candidate. Those policies are wrong, and he's just too inept or cowardly or unprincipled or whatever to follow through on the commitments.
But the thing you have to posit, if you're going to reprimand Obama as cowardly or say he got scared or whatever, what is positive there is he's not scared of nothing, right? He's scared of something, and what he's scared of is that he would find himself, if he's stuck by what he said then, on the wrong side of the country that elected him. So when you say he's broken his covenant with the American people,
I just don't know how. I don't know how it's possible to say that when he won the election, not mentioning these policies as an ancillary aspect of his candidacy, but featuring them as a cornerstone.
Okay,
so it's extremely impossible to convince me that had he followed through on closing Guantanamo or giving due process to terrorist suspects, that the same country that elected him on the promise of doing that would have suddenly turned against him.
Let's give him credit, but give him credit for knowing his business. And maybe he is somebody who knows something about the process by which he got elected. Said, I got to, that closed Guantanamo due process for terrorist stuff was fine in the primary, but it hurt me in the general. I was elected in the general because the economy was terrible, and unemployment was high, and incomes weren't rising, and people wanted healthcare reform. But this was my biggest point of vulnerability. And now, if I do this as president, I'm going to be cooked. So, as president, I'm going to jettison all those things I said in the Democratic primary to assuage a portion of American public opinion. As president, I'm going to speak to America.
But polls disprove that. I mean, huge majorities, before he abandoned it, were in favor of closing Guantanamo. Huge majorities were in favor of restoring civil liberties at the expense of security before he abandoned that. Huge majorities were actually in favor of investigating Bush crimes until Obama abandoned that. So
here's where you need to be tougher on yourself. I'm sorry. Here's where you need to be tougher on yourself. You need to ask yourself, am I calling on the president to be principled, or am I calling on the president to be popular? Because what you're saying is, you could do all these things that Glenn Greenwald that all the political professionals in the Democratic Party tell you not to do, that your own instincts tell you not to do, and Glenn Greenwald, I am telling you how to connect with the American public.
No,
I'm also telling you how to be principled.
the things that you promised that you were going to do when you stood up repeatedly, not just in front of Democratic voters, but in front of the American electorate, and swore that you would do and said you believed in, and the change that you were intended to bring. And I know some people might think this is unreasonable, but I actually expect you to follow through on those. I think that you ought to be held to those. I don't think that it's saying anything more than that.
Why do you think he chose not to do it? I mean, who's he scared of if he's not doing it? Rush Limbaugh?
No. I mean, I think that
Rush Limbaugh has like 2 million listeners.
I think in order to stand up, for example, to the permanent national security state that we were just talking about, or the permanent intelligence community. It used to be that Dwight Eisenhower warned 40 years ago that military-industrial complex was so powerful that
why is he afraid of the permanent?
Democratically elected
They work for him. He promotes them. He hires. He fires. Why is he scared of them?
No,
because they connect to something. That's where the country
is. It doesn't work
is.
that way. They're permanent. They're permanent part of the structure. They have power. They have powers independent of the president. I mean, that's not a controversial proposition. That presidents have a very difficult time confronting the military establishment, confronting the CIA, confronting the intelligence world. There are all kinds of things. Those factions in Washington, just like there's a lobbyist faction in Washington and a corporate faction in Washington that has as much power in some senses more power than the president. All these things have a huge cost to take these factions on and to defy them and to do it and to do what they insist not be done. And
if the reports are correct,
you need courage to do it, and you need to pay the price to do it. And if you're not, you won't.
If the reports are correct, the professional military did not want to do this raid. They thought it was too risky. They wanted to drop a big bomb on the thing and leave a crater.
But they have wanted to stay in Afghanistan. They did want to escalate in Afghanistan.
But they didn't want to do this thing. So he's able to take them on, and they do work for him, and he hires and he fires and he promotes. But if you're saying so on the thing that is bugging you, which is that, and he seems personally to have made the decision. What I want is to have gunmen in that house looking at bin Laden in the face and then killing him on the spot. That's what I want. You guys want to do it from 30,000 feet. I want it up close and personal. He's got. I mean, partly that may reflect, I think, his moral fiber, that he has, the feelings that a lot of people do, that is the right thing to do. But it also may reflect a sense of, that Glenn Greenwald's reading of American public opinion here may not be as astute as all of that.
I'll just. There are times when Obama has defied the military and intelligence establishments. One of the most noble instances where he did it, where he really provoked their outrage and anger, was when he released the Bush-era OLC memos detailing the torture techniques that had been authorized by the Justice Department and had been used by the CIA, and the CIA was absolutely furious about that. There are times, and the example that you just gave, there's also they had reluctance, more so than he did, to get involved in Libya. So I'm not saying he's never able or never willing to challenge those factions. I'm saying that in order to do it, you have to pay a price for it. It's often very difficult. You can't always do it. And I think it's easier to do it in terms of when you're the commander-in-chief ordering specific operational directives, like I want you to go in and send Navy SEALs in, as opposed to obliterating the building, versus essentially changing the general direction of America's war policy or its counterterrorism policies away from what it had been over the last decade, or even, as you point out, longer, into a fundamentally different direction. Those kind of changes require real fights and a paying of a price that I just don't think he was willing to pay, assuming he ever believed in those things in the first place, which I think is a big if as well, whether he was just cynically adopting those positions for political gain, as opposed to actually believing them. I mean, that's a huge if too. You need to first believe in them, and then you need to be willing to pay the price to fight for them. And I think it's a very open question on all of those issues, whether he even believed in them in the first place.
A discussion I've often had with some of my more conservative friends, more conservative than me. I always thought, and I didn't think specifically of you in this regard, but it would have, I think you would have had an interesting reaction to it, is when Dick Cheney stepped forward in, I think it was 2009, delivered those blistering series of speeches about the Obama administration. I always thought it would have been at least funnier and maybe more accurate if he had stepped forward and said, during the campaign, a lot of hot things were said and a lot of accusations get thrown, but now the campaign is over, I want to say, welcome to the club. And we are, I'm looking at what this young president is doing, and I'm seeing more continuity than disagreement. And I want to say, I fully endorse him. I wrap my arms around him, and I see him as a leader successor. And that would have been hilarious.
No, what's interesting about that, though, is you've really seen an evolution in how even the hardest core conservatives, national security conservatives like Dick Cheney, talk about Obama. It is true in 2009, it was just reflexive that people on the right attack a Democratic president for being soft on terror, soft on national security, jeopardizing the nation. It's just almost like an instinct, like a reflex. But Cheney actually did give an interview just like, I think 3 months ago or so, in which he basically said what you just, said it would be funny if he did say, which is, look, it is true that in the beginning I was criticizing Obama a lot, but I think he's really come around and has seen that a lot of these policies that he was attacking that we adopted, he's seen that they've actually turned out to be right, and there has been much more of a continuity, and I praise the president for that. Michael Hayden has said that, who was a harsh critic of the president early on. The Heritage Foundation has said, he's not just Bush light, he's Bush on these policies. And when for even Dick Cheney to come out and say there is now more continuity than there was, and he's obviously seen that we're right about some things, and I give him some credit for that, that to me is a pretty compelling indication of just how far astray Obama the president is from Obama the candidate. And you think that's a great thing, and I think it's not a great thing. But
maybe that shows
even in that's pretty revealing.
That the government, that this is sort of what we want. We want to have our leaders bashing each other over where taxes should be and where spending should be, and how we should fund health care, and how big the park should be, and whether there should be logging on all of those kinds of things. But we want to have some consistent idea of the national interests of the American state that continue election after election and that maintain the security of the country. That's certainly what I think of as the system working.
Right, and I think what the system working means is adopting policies that are effective and legal and ethical and in conformity with what we say we are and what our goals are. And so the fact that both parties get together and agree on something, both parties got together and agreed more or less on the Iraq War, doesn't mean it's a good policy. I think you have to look at the individual policy, and I don't think those policies. I think Obama was right in what he said about those things during the campaign, which is why I wanted him to be president. And I think he's wrong now to have abandoned those. But unless, I don't know, we're at the end of this hour. Do you have other things you want to?
No, I think we've covered a lot of territory at blistering speed. And this time it was your dogs who were barking. I was happy to see.
I don't know. I'm going to deny that. I'll conduct an investigation and see if that's true.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, David, talk to you.